Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. My name is Dr. Drum McNaughton, and I'm the CEO of The Change Leader, a management consultancy that helps university leaders create sustainable higher ed institutions through holistic approaches to strategic management, university academics and operations, change management, leadership, and governance. Our podcast brings you the latest in higher ed news, as well as some of the top experts in our profession who will share with you their perspectives on how you can grow your institution. Looking out a few months, there's a couple of conferences on the horizon that you might want to be aware of. First is the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education's annual conference is being held in Pittsburgh, October 2nd through 5th. And finally, the Transnational Association of Christian Colleges and Schools annual conference is being held in Dallas, October 30th through November 2nd. Our guest today is Dr. Nicholas Dirks, former chancellor of the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Dirks is an internationally renowned leader in higher education and is known for his commitment to accessible, high-quality undergraduate education, to the globalization of the university, and to innovation and collaboration across the disciplines and between universities and outside partners. Dr. Dirks has a background in both public and private higher ed. Before coming to Berkeley, he was the Executive Vice President for Arts and Sciences and the Dean of Faculty at Columbia University, and prior to Columbia, was a professor of history and anthropology at University of Michigan. He also taught Asian history and civilization at the California Institute of Technology. Dr. Dirks received his BA from Wesleyan University and his MA and PhD from the University of Chicago. He's published 4 major books, edited 3 more, and written numerous essays, articles, and papers. Well, Nick, welcome, and thank you so much for agreeing to be a guest on our show.
Great to be here.
You've led Berkeley through some very, quote, interesting times. You've got a lot of experience in higher ed, public and privates. What were your expectations that you had going into the position there at Berkeley?
Well, as you and our listeners know, Berkeley is one of the great universities of the world. It routinely gets ranked really at the very top, certainly as the number 1 public university in the U.S. And its academic distinction is sort of legion across almost every field, discipline, school, and program. So I came here knowing that its academic reputation was stellar. But I also came here knowing that it had gone through very tough times. After the Great Recession of 2008-9, the University of California in general, and Berkeley in particular, had to cut dramatically. There were stories in the New York Times about phone lines being taken out of faculty offices and furloughs being taken and so on. So I came here with a sense that Berkeley had been through tough times. But in 2012, when I was named to the position, I also knew that California was coming out of a recession and that Jerry Brown, as governor, was doing a lot to restore fiscal responsibility in the government of the state. And I assumed, therefore, that there would be a return, if not to pre-recession levels, to something close to that when I came in terms of state funding. I found, however, that was not the case. And when I got named as chancellor, 12% of our budget came from the state. When my predecessor, Bob Bergeneau, was hired in 2004, about 34% of the Berkeley budget came from state funding. So it had taken a huge hit, but I thought we were going to go back. And I think, like many leaders of public universities in the period over the last 10 years, we've realized we're not actually going to go back to the situation that existed before the Great Recession.
And you're absolutely right. In so many universities, I mean, Wisconsin being one of them, they've had so many cutbacks. Missouri, Illinois, you can just name state after state that have had so many cutbacks. And where does that funding come from? One of our guests recently said that higher ed has never really gone through the downsizing or right-sizing that corporations did back in the 90s. And in many cases, they've become bloated bureaucracies. Now, you can argue one way or the other about that, but the fact of the matter is you've got a lot of people there. You've got a lot of jobs that need to be done They may have been invented to just make sure that there are people there, but the funding's never going to go back to where it was. And so how do you deal with those kind of things?
Absolutely. It is certainly argued by many that the administrative staffing of many universities has become bloated over the last several decades. But I don't think people who have not been in administrative positions understand the extent to which a lot of the growth of administrative staffing has come in areas that respond to needs for dealing with regulations, the kinds of issues that come up with federal funding, the need to try to take advantage of new kinds of discoveries that come out of research that are sponsored by the university in terms of intellectual property, technology transfer, and so on. And that indeed, for the most part, what the administrators in universities do is to serve faculty and students, not just to serve their own interests. Now, have we sometimes grown too fat? Absolutely. But universities are being asked every year, I think, to do more and more. And now we have to do more and more with less and less in the way of resources. And that really is a challenge. And one example that is in the news almost every day has to do with sexual harassment on campus. Well, one of the things I had to do during my time at Berkeley was to triple the size of our Title IX office just to deal with the level of activity that was going on and the demands by the public, and rightful demands, that we act responsibly, quickly, and hold ourselves accountable. But you can't do that unless you increase staffing in some areas.
Very true. And with the changes that are coming out of the education department with respect to sexual harassment and sexual assault, the new rulings, that's going to have a potential big impact on what universities can do and what they do.
Well, I think we certainly have seen a lot of changes just in the last five to 8 years in terms of how universities are held responsible now for not just the actions of students and faculty today, but oftentimes the actions of students and faculty 10, 15, 20 years ago. And indeed, I think it is absolutely justifiable to ask institutions like universities, and of course other institutions are in the news these days as well, but to ask universities to be more responsible, to be transparent, but also to hold all of the members of their community, whether faculty, whether very senior faculty, or students or members of the staff, to standards that we now understand require us to have environments in which other members of the community can interact and do their work without any threat of any kind of harassment, whether it's workplace bullying, whether it's sexual innuendo and the like, or whether it's sexual assault and sexual violence. And
the political climate has made it far more difficult. When you take that to the next step, the legacy of Berkeley, long reputation with respect to intellectual center, like you said, #1 public university in the U.S., 22 Nobel winners who were on faculty. But then it also has the reputation from being the center of the Vietnam War protests back in the 60s. Now, there was a period of relative quiet for 35, 40 years, but then right at the end of your watch, you had the alt-right, and that became a flashpoint for demonstrations.
Yes, it did. One of the things that was fun during my second year in office here was that I got to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the free speech movement, which took place in 1964 and that rocked the University of California, Berkeley campus at the time, and really did, as you just noted, set in motion Berkeley's central role in student protest in relationship to the Vietnam War and the expansion of the war into Cambodia and the relationship of the university to the war effort more generally in the 1960s and early 70s. And although Berkeley became quieter, I wouldn't say it went completely dormant. It was the center of activity around the anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s. And then during the Occupy movement, Berkeley was also at the center of a good deal of protest. There were two major Occupy movements that took place on campus in 2009 and 2011. And in both instances, there had been a lot of concern about everything from what it meant to the institution to close down buildings during active term time. And then, of course, various incidents involving the police, the use of pepper spray and batons and the like. So when I came here, and certainly in my interview, I should say, they asked me a great deal about if I had any experience in student protest. I came here with the understanding that Berkeley was always a place where you were liable to have protests about this, that, and the other thing. But nothing, as you just noted, prepared us fully for what happened after the election of Donald Trump. And then when Milo Yiannopoulos came to town on February 1st, 2017, and we saw a major conflagration on campus that took us right back to the most violent episodes on university campuses in the late 60s and early 70s.
How did you prepare for that?
Well, when I first came to Berkeley, I realized we had a protest response team that met every couple of weeks, which facilitated conversations across different units and, of course, with the campus police. So we had already had meetings that had prepared for smaller kinds of protests. But when Milo Yiannopoulos announced that he was coming and the Berkeley College Republicans invited him to the Berkeley campus, we began to realize we were going to be seeing something entirely different. A couple of weeks before, Milo had gone to the University of California at Davis. There had been major protests. They actually called off the speech. And just the week before he came, he went to the University of Washington in Seattle, and there was a shooting, and a protester had been shot and injured in the melee that was taking place outside the speech. So we knew that there was potential for violent activity. So we worked on a plan with the campus police. We actually had about 85 police positioned and ready to go as long as it needed to protect the event. And we just had a whole choreographed plan for dealing with protests, keeping the protesters away from the people who were attending the lecture and trying to secure public safety. But what happened, and what was, of course, recorded on national and even international television, was the fact that we had a group from the alt-left, the Antifa, march in using black bloc tactics, about 150 individuals wearing black. They were all wearing masks. They had knapsacks, and clearly they had these backpacks that contained various kinds of explosives. They came in, they infiltrated the crowd, and then they attacked the student union, broke open the glass doors, and caused the police to declare on the ground that it was an unsafe situation. They escorted Milo away from campus and called off the event, but a major fire began burning outside the student union. $100,000 worth of damage was done on the campus. Probably more than that in dollar cost was done in damage to the city of Berkeley and the periphery of campus. And it wasn't until about 11:30 at night that the protesters finally left. And I have to say it was a fairly tense evening from every possible point of view, not least because at some point the protesters decided they were going to come to the chancellor's house and take me on personally. The reason we knew that they were outsiders was they didn't know where the chancellor lived. So I was actually very fortunate about their ignorance on that count. But really, back to your question, the whole point about what happened that night is it was unprecedented. And so it was impossible to prepare for. It led, of course, in turn to several more events in Berkeley, both in the city of Berkeley and on the campus. But we had been warned. And so that event became a kind of learning experience. It was, of course, just to say one more thing about it, it was an illustration that whatever precautions we took, whatever preparations we planned, were insufficient to allow that event to take place. But when we woke up the next morning and got a tweet from President Trump threatening to cancel all federal funding for Berkeley because we didn't protect free speech, we thought at the very least, perhaps he'd been misinformed about the efforts that we made to allow that event to go on.
Well, that should be a badge of honor for you. I think you were the first chancellor, president ever to receive a text from President Trump about anything.
Yes, I think that is my claim to fame here. Trust me, it wasn't a pleasant tweet to receive because even though we were rapidly assured that he couldn't call off all federal funding, it meant that Berkeley was in the crosshairs. And to be in the crosshairs of the President of the United States may be a badge of honor, but it's also a serious cause for concern.
No doubt. So obviously, tremendous amount of learnings. A good friend of mine said, plans are nothing. It's all in the implementation. sometimes you see things that you just aren't expecting. So how do you plan for that? Do you do kind of, I would say like a mock interview, or do you do preparedness trials, things along those lines to get the university ready for something that may or may not happen?
I think the thing that we learned in that event was that whether something's going to happen or not, you have to be prepared for it. And of course, 2 months later, when Ann Coulter was coming to campus and then decided that she wasn't going to come to campus, we had to, in any event, have the police there because there were others who were going to come regardless of whether she spoke or not. And that time we actually had 300 police, and we spent a good deal of money just making sure that nothing terrible would happen. So you always have to be prepared for the worst, I guess, and you have to think through different kinds of scenarios that, again, we learned you are not always prepared for by past occurrences.
I understand completely, and the financial aspects of this are tremendous. A university with Berkeley's resources can somewhat manage that, but if you talk at a smaller university, not even a state university, how do they deal with this kind of costs?
Well, the costs can be huge, and we spent millions of dollars ultimately over the course of the last year on events that for the most part didn't happen. But because the first event did happen, and because the first event was so violent, we didn't want to take any chances. The other thing is that we ended up spending money in large part to demonstrate to our critics that we really were prepared to go out on a limb to protect free speech. Despite Trump's tweet and despite a lot of the criticism we got on Fox News and Breitbart and other news sources, so-called news sources, we decided that we really did have to show them that, no, we believe in free speech. We're committed to protect it. The First Amendment is of vital importance, not just to our society, but to our public universities. And we were going to do whatever it took. But you're right. I mean, first of all, even though Berkeley has a lot of resources, we've been going through major financial problems. We didn't get the kind of support from the state that we expected, and we had a lot of debt for buildings that we had to repair because they were seismically challenged. We had a lot of other pressures, and in the course of this, we also increased our student body in response to different concerns on the part of both the governor and the legislature and the state that we weren't admitting enough California students. So we were in a difficult financial position. So it wasn't as if we had a few $1 million sitting in reserve that we could just pull out for the police. I think other publics and smaller colleges are even more challenged, though. And yet, when universities and colleges across the country are being accused of not protecting free speech, we are, again, I think all of us obliged to make very clear that these are values that we hold, even though we hold a lot of other values as well, like using our money for the education of our students.
Which is what it should be done for, and not have to worry about all the extra police. But this is where we are right now, and you do what you have to do.
Indeed.
From sitting from the president's chair, what advice would you give to your counterparts around these type of events? How can they prepare for them and be proactive in their preparation?
Yeah, well, I think a couple of things I could say. First, it's very important that you get your processes and procedures worked through so you have some protections for the institution. One of the things that we learned was that when an event becomes a public kind of circus of the kind that we had here, you can be represented as having not done certain things that, in fact, you did. But if you have clear processes where you tell student groups when they invite somebody to campus, they have to get permission. They have to make sure that they work with you to make sure you can have the event at the right time, in the proper place, with the proper kind of protections. And that requires being flexible, but it also requires following procedure. When Ann Coulter came, they simply announced that she was going to come on a Thursday of the last day of classes, of the last week of classes, and we didn't have any big auditoria that were available. That's when final lectures were being given that we didn't want to cancel because that would have been it before the final exams. So we asked her to delay by 5 days. But because of the back and forth and because we didn't have a clear set of procedures that we just take out and show the television cameras, we weren't in as strong a position as we might have been otherwise. So I would advise anyone who's confronting these kinds of situations just to be very clear about what the responsibility of student groups are in terms of getting permission and working with the administration to make sure the event can take place in the right way.
And then there's the whole piece with the Board of Regents or your Board of Trustees. We won't get into that right now, but of course, that's always a big situation. It's up to them and the administration as well to be able to look at all the different risks that are out there and put plans into place, correct?
Yes, ultimately, the regents are responsible for our fiduciary conduct. And of course, that goes along with questions around risk, having to do with everything from public safety to your reputation. And of course, in this case, our reputation around issues concerning free speech was the critical thing. But we were also very concerned about public safety. And the shooting in Seattle at the University of Washington reminded us that these events can go very, very badly if you're not properly prepared.
It reminds me of the times that I spent in the Navy flying airplanes. You know, you train, and hopefully you don't have that emergency that you were training for. But if you do, you're ready for it.
Yeah, I've never flown a plane, but I rely on my pilots having done all kinds of planning and preparation and scenario training ahead of time.
We certainly hope they do. So, we are coming to the end of our time, and I would love to continue further. Hopefully we can do another one of these. So just tell me, what's next for you personally and professionally?
Well, I've taken a little bit of time off. It was a very intense time at Berkeley between visits by Milo and major financial issues and crises around athletics and the graduation rates of our football players and a host of other issues. It was a 24/7 job. So I spent the last year doing a little bit of recovery, doing a bit of research again for the first time in 15 years. Went back to India to actually do some research as not just to raise money from alumni. And I've now been working with a number of universities in China and India and giving them advice about how to develop the liberal arts, which I think is a very important development in terms of global education. And I've been working with a company that's establishing K12 schools globally in places like China and India, as well as the US, and learning more about that sector of education. At the same time, I've been, of course, deeply concerned with how we can prepare students across the world to take advantage of the kind of educational opportunities that exist at places like Berkeley and Columbia, where I taught before I came here.
Do you want to talk a little bit about your K12 venture?
Well, the K12 Venture is a set of schools that are going to be linked together. It's going to be a global network that will have a kind of common curriculum across different countries and will reflect an effort to develop what is a genuinely global kind of education, with the idea that every student, no matter where they are, whether they're growing up in China or India or England or the US, is prepared for the new global world in which we live and has a certain kind of global citizenship or education to attain a kind of global citizenship that is important. In the current age, obviously, there's a lot of critiques around globalization. And I confronted some of that when I was at Berkeley as well. We were engaged in collaborations with universities in China and universities elsewhere. And there are people for whom those kinds of collaborations are not a good idea at this point. But I think one of the great things about colleges and universities is that they are genuinely international in terms of the student body, international in terms of the faculty. And they have the capacity to be, in some ways, the most successful global institutions by instilling a real sense of understanding across cultural, across religious, across ethnic and racial divisions, and can help us develop the kind of grounding that we need to get along when faced with the kinds of challenges that we see every day, whether it's in terms of economic competition, whether it's in terms of the need to collaborate and cooperate on dealing with climate change or global epidemics, or for that matter, dealing with some of the kinds of geopolitical tensions that seem to be so much a part of our world today.
I think you're spot on with that, and it's a great, great ambition to have. I initially thought that business could be the ubiquitous thing that would tie countries and cultures together. I think there's too much greed that goes on, and it becomes a competition. I think getting folks at the education, the K-12 level, fostering those inquisitive beliefs in them that want them to, drive them to learn, to start to understand each other, and start to understand that cultures are just that. They're cultures. There's differences between people, but when you strip off the skin, we all look alike. So why not foster that kind of culture that's more inquisitive, more outreaching, and more accepting of others? And I think this is a great thing that you guys are doing.
Well, thank you very much. I agree with you absolutely. And I think all of us in the world of education in one way or another are trying to work to really figure out what it means to talk about global citizenship in a world where God knows we're going to need it going forward.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for being our guest today. It's been very enlightening, and I look forward to future times.
Well, thank you, Drum, very much. I enjoyed this conversation a great deal.
Thanks for listening this week, and a special thank you to this week's guest, Dr. Nick Dirks. Thanks, Nick. Greatly appreciate your sharing your insights with us. Our next guest will be Dave Moha, partner and tax specialist at Kaplan Krause. Dave will share with us the latest in tax strategies for higher ed and how you can make the new tax laws work for you. If you like this podcast, please take a minute to subscribe to the show. And if you're listening on the Apple Podcast app, would you please take a moment to give us a rating and review? You can find out more information and show notes at changinghighered.com. And if you have guests and/or other topics you'd like to hear about, please email us at podcast@changinghighered.com to let us know. Remember, creating sustainable higher ed institutions requires three things: taking a holistic view of your institution, aligning strategies, structures, and processes, and ensuring stakeholders are attuned to where you're going. Without any of those three things, you won't get your institution where you want it to go. Until next time.